Hey guys, it's me Uchiha D Itachi. I'm sorry for being gone for a long time. I was gone because my account got deleted, but don't worry, I'm back now. Anyway, today we have a new video. What if Ace came back to life part 1. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button. Disclaimer. One Piece is owned by Eiichiro Oda. I do not own anything One Piece related. Obviously. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Ace knew that he had died. It wasn't his memories of colliding into Akainu's fist or the lack of consciousness that he was now surrounded in. It was just instinct, fact almost. He could no longer feel his heart beating in his chest, could no longer command his body to move no matter how hard he tried. And surprisingly, he was at peace with it. He didn't have any burning feeling to race back to the world of the living. He'd accepted that saving Luffy was enough, that his brother being safe was worth not seeing another day. He still had his concerns, of course, the safety of his father, Marco, all of the crew's well-being whirling in his mind. But he was at rest now. Well, that's what he thought. Before he had spent 2 years in absolute darkness. When describing personality traits of Ace, patience is not one you would come across. He was ultimately convinced he was in hell. And he had his reasons. The first being, of course, was the identity of the blood that ran through his veins. Being the son of such a monster, he was never shown mercy in life, let alone in death. The second reason being that he wasn't exactly an angel in his life. He was a pirate. And being a pirate, you had to commit sins to survive. But the third reason? The reason he actually believed he was in hell? There was only so much waiting in endless darkness that Ace could take. Countless times he tried to move his dead hands, struggled to open his eyes that were unable to see anymore. But what annoyed him more than anything was he could still think. He was awake. Technically. He could easily still recount the many precious memories he had spent with his brothers and father. He would regularly reenact in his head the whole traumatic experience of Impel Down, of Marineford. Of seeing his brother's face in total and utter pain as he rushed in front of him. If only his mouth would move, he could speak. Shout even. But then that voice. The only thing that would speak to him. The only sound or being into the complete darkness that always surrounded him. The voice of reason. Stop trying. You can't do anything about it now. You gave up your life. You saved Luffy. So just stop trying. There's no point. You can't escape death, you know. Stop trying. Everyone you brought to that execution. They shouldn't have been there. How could you let them die? Stop trying. You shouldn't have even existed in the first place. Roger was a monster. You are a monster. Stop trying. You're dead. You are truly alone now. So, just stop trying. A rasped and choked voice suddenly hit the darkness. It struggled vigorously with its words, though it was filled with so much determination, so much conviction. Ace couldn't believe it was his own voice. And never. He didn't want to die, despite knowing that fact that he was already dead. He wanted nothing more than to see his family, to continue on with the unique and truly baffling adventure they had shared. He needed to know what had happened to them, if they escaped, if they were alive. A silence soon hovered in the air after the words left his mouth, both the voice and Ace unable to comprehend what just happened. That was impossible, right? Ace had asked himself. Expecting the voice to respond to him, the ex-commander inwardly twitched, though only more silence responded, leaving himself with his thoughts again. Did I just speak? Inwardly swallowing any other thought down, Ace focused all his remaining strength on the previous fact. He had spoke. It couldn't have been his imagination. Because if I just spoke, then that means I have to break dash. Like being hit in the face by a blustering wave, Ace was hit with the desperation of oxygen in his throat. A tingling feeling spiraled down his immobile arms, ones that haven't moved for years. Flinging themselves onto Ace's neck, his nails started to claw at his skin for air, as the previously lifeless chest bounced back to life. Slowly, but surely, it started to move up and down, causing a confused yelp to whimper from Ace's lips. Thrashing his legs upwards, he was quickly met with a bellowing thud, followed by a painful hit to his leg. Hell if he cared though, he knew this feeling. Since he'd entered this darkness, he'd been hoping, dreaming of this feeling he now felt through his whole body. He was alive. But that wasn't possible. He knew too well that he had died, the endless amount of waiting only justifying that. Focusing his mind onto the newfound pain in his leg once more, Ace managed a small smirk to crawl onto his lips. He was dead. That fact was true enough. But for whatever reason, he wasn't now. He didn't have one clue about how that was even possible, but for now, he would just be grateful. Pushing all of those thoughts to the side, he continued to thrash his legs upwards, despite the bruising it was doing to his previously immobile leg, suddenly causing bits of debris to lightly fall on top of Ace's face. Flickering his eyes open, he was met with darkness. But not the same darkness he had been living in for who knows how long. This new darkness was hinted with a murky brown color, causing Ace to fling his arms around to see exactly where he was. Only being able to stretch his arms out to the length of his elbows, thoughts, and not overly happy ones, crossed his mind in where he might actually be. To confirm his suspicions, Ace focused all his energy he had onto his newly animated arm, causing a little light to flicker on the end of his finger. His eyes winced at the new light, as held the finger up, bringing light to where he actually was. You've got to be kidding me. He was inside a coffin, buried underground. Hours had passed since Ace's recovery. He'd stubbornly refused to call it anything else, and not before long, he was already in a situation which he may or may not end up losing his life again. He was stuck. In a hole. Underground. He'd be damned if he let himself starve to death. He'd never live it down if he were to die, again, after defying the odds and waking up. So, as his first attempt of escaping this new form of muddy, grisly hell, he moved every possible muscle as far as he could. Attempting to hit everywhere, Ace silently begged for the ground to break above, and shine a light of hope. Of course, the fire thrower wasn't blessed with the fortune called luck. So the action resulted in the freckled man to be covered in countless pieces of dirt and bugs, which easily didn't help the man's already irritated mood. After realizing that hitting the ground above wouldn't solve anything, Ace thought for a brief moment, before shrugging off the first thing he could think of. Scream at the top of his voice until someone hears him. Is anyone up there? He didn't particularly care how stupid he looked or sounded at this moment. His stomach was starting to growl, and after having not eaten in, how long has it been, he was starting to get pissed. Flames began to flicker on his shoulders and... Wait! Kajiro! Ace screamed out, a ray of fire bursting from his fist towards the ground above. Sadly, this just again resulted in more ground falling on top of the already pissed and hungry Ace. Damn it! Ace yelled, shaking his hand to rid the fire. It's obvious that I would have lost practice, but... I'm too weak at the moment to do any damage. Maybe? Meh. Worth to give it a shot. Heiken! Ace shouted again. A huge explosion trembled from above, effectively moving like the fire thrower had hoped for. But, this time, he was not met with specks of dirt and worms as he had before. Instead, he was greeted by an avalanche of dirt to fall from above. Oh sure dash! Reaching upwards, towards the sky, Ace managed to sneak his way through the crumbled dirt, using his hands, feet, elbows, his chin, anything to climb his way up. After minutes of climbing very slowly up, finally he saw his exit, a small speck of light. This tiniest bit of light shined harshly on the tip of his forehead, blinding one of his eyes. But he was too overjoyed to care. With one last punch upwards, he lifted the ground above him, a cool breeze hitting his hand and more light shined through. Reaching, he looked around for a stable place to pull himself up. With grunts of pain he lifted himself from the grave, his body breathing heavily, eyes wincing at the light that now surrounded him. Turning around to grasp his surroundings, his eyes were met with a huge inanimate object, more in the shape of a monument. Focusing closely at what the monument had written in the stone, his pupils went huge. This is? Portgas de Ace. Chapter 2. The huge monument stood in front of him. His hair blowing before his eyes. Seeing what no man should ever see. The last statement of his life. Portgas de Ace. For a few moments Ace just stood there, frozen to the ground. It was his grave. A grave which seemed to have been standing for longer than Ace had anticipated, the signs of age wearing at the sides. It was beautifully decorated, the surroundings seemingly cared for. The grave itself wasn't overly decorated, causing Ace to let out a weak laugh. Though it wasn't happy expression, for the ex-commander was barely keeping his emotions together, his mind recapturing the moment he had died in his brother's arms. He really did break the promise that he had sworn to Luffy. You've got to promise me, Ace. A tearful Luffy started, harshly gripping the edges of the straw hat perched on his head. Don't. Letting the tears fall further down his face with a wince, the straw-hatted boy gathered up most of his strength, yelling it out with his words. Don't ever die, He broke it. Well, he had broke it. He wasn't completely sure now. And that seemed to be the perfect time for Ace to reflect on how he was still standing. Blinking a few times, he mumbled to himself, instinctively patting himself on the chest with a glazed look. What the dash? How the hell am I? He was dead. And last time Ace checked, the dead stayed dead. But here he was. He was, somehow, still alive. Peeling his eyes slowly off the monument, he gazed down to analyze his appearance. His gaze was met with scratched, bruised skin, littered painfully in bits of dirt and debris that stuck out from his chest. His skin was unnaturally pale, unlike it being a tanned color he was all too used to, causing for a small frown to appear on his lips. Clenching his fists together, Ace took note of the broken nails and dirted hands, the cuts slowly beginning to throb. A thought flashed through Ace's mind, causing him to hastily look down the left side of his arm. The sight seemingly lifting his mood, the ex-commander's eyes stayed glued to the bold ASCE tattoo which thankfully, was still there. Of course, his necklace, hat and knife were missing, but were quickly found seeing as they were placed on top of his grave. This caused his mind to wonder on how someone would have been able to retrieve his belongings, inwardly gulping at the thought of his dead body being stripped of the said items. Narrowing his eyes onto the familiar red necklace hanging beside his beloved hat, Ace blinked, his eyebrows raising at the thought of someone reassembling it. It had surely shattered, but here it was, in one piece. Shoving the thought off, Ace sighed. Bringing his hands to the back of his head, the fire thrower closed his eyes, trying to gather his memories on what had happened. His eyes almost instantly shooting open with panic, the fire thrower glanced down to his chest below, his pupils doubling in size. Right in the center of his chest, a horribly gigantic scar lay, the shape recognizable to the fist that killed Ace. Gulping, Ace stared, his mouth becoming dry at the sight. His shoulders ever so slightly shaking, Ace turned his head around to peek at his back. Letting a relieved smile crawl across his lips, the ex-commander let out a sigh of relief. It was still there. Of course, now there was a huge scar canceling out more of the middle section of the tattoo, but it still remained. The mark that showed that he was Whitebeard's son. As Ace smiled to himself, a slight breeze picked up, freeing Ace from his thoughts and causing him to snap back into the real world. Flipping his head to the side to dodge the ray of sunlight that had shined onto him, the fire thrower winced his eyes. "Damn it!" he mumbled to himself, shaking his head. Peering back up to the grave before him, a sight slowly creeped into the corner of his eye, causing for the ex-commander to freeze instantly on the spot. To the side of him, stood another monument similar to his, but double the size. A white cloak hung there, fluttering along with the wind, causing Ace to stumble back. He knew that cloak, heck. He'd be able to recognize it out of thousands. But, why was it here? Hesitantly moving his stare down to the words etched into the monument, the ex-commander fell to the floor. With frozen eyes, a stutter of words fell out of his mouth, his whole body shaking. "Oyaji?" Leaning against Whitebeard's grave, Ace remained silent, allowing for the breeze to cover the ex-commander's trembling eyes. "He's dead, you know." Throwing his hands to his face with fury, the fire thrower slammed a fist into the ground below, biting down on his lip. "Damn it!" he yelled out, hoping for any voice to shake him and tell him he was dreaming. Lifting his hands up to his forehead once more, the ex-commander screamed, digging his nails into his head. "Why? Why did you come for me?" Silence. Half of him wanted to sit there waiting, wishing for his father to rise out of the grave like he just did. He'd even contemplated digging up the ground beneath him, hoping to see the same equally confused Oyaji buried alive. But after spending hours waiting, listening for any sign of life, it hit him that wasn't going to be the case. He should have known it was coming. He knew from the moment that Squad stabbed him in Marineford, that there wasn't much of a chance of him surviving the war. He knew that Whitebeard would happily sacrifice himself for his sons' lives, but to think that it actually happened. He couldn't accept it. He'd always wished that while he was inside the darkness, listening to the taunts the voice was throwing him, that his family would have escaped. That they'd taken Luffy and escaped the war together, not leaving anyone behind. But he didn't know anything. Because he had been stuck in that hole this whole time. He couldn't even imagine what his family went through. He should have been there. It was his fault that Oyaji was dead. If it wasn't for him, the war would have never happened. He should have listened to his family's cries as he'd left to fight Teach. Then, now they'd all be together, on board the Moby Dick. They'd all still be alive. Allowing for the tears to finally fall down his face, Ace held his arms around himself firmly, weeping beside the grand monument, not caring if anyone was around. He sat there for hours, his mind clouded with the events of Marineford that led to his captain's demise. Apologies fell from his mouth as quickly as his tears, silence being the only response. Though as the sun began to set, a small unexpected smile seemed to make its way onto his face. Allowing for the last of his tears to fall down his freckled skin, Ace let out a small laugh, his eyes worn. Even though those thoughts were circling round in his mind, he couldn't help but hear them. Oyaji, Marco, Thatch, Vista, even Izo laughing. All of them, telling Ace that all he was saying was complete bullshit. They were family. And family keep each other alive, despite the circumstances. He knew this, after all, he'd do the same for them. Doubt still filled his mind, he sighed, his hands still shaking from the shock. Lifting his head up towards the cloak still wavering in the wind, Ace smiled. Feeling drowsiness edge at the ends of his sight, the fire thrower mumbled, the image of his family stuck in his mind. "You idiots." Chapter 3. Ace had assumed it had been around a day since he, as he put it, woken up. Most of those hours though were spent beside Oyaji's grave, the ex-commander throwing countless questions towards his grave. "Did you even try to escape? After I died? Are Marco and the others, are they?" Gulping, Ace closed his eyes, his thoughts racing. "Are they still alive? Oyaji. How am I alive?" Silence. Each time Ace spoke, he was always met with the slender and quiet sound of emptiness. Of course, it was a different silence to the one he'd been in for that unknown amount of time, but nevertheless, it was just as painful. For a large part of his life, Ace had been surrounded by his friends and his family. He had been surrounded by the sounds and sights of freedom, enjoying the ocean alongside his brothers. But when he was sitting there, lying beside Oyaji's grave, for the first time since meeting Luffy and Sabo, he was truly alone. And would he stand for that? "Ha!" the fire thrower mumbled out, determination tinted in his voice. Absolutely not. He was now far beyond pissed for that. No matter how hard it would be, he would find them. He would find Marco, find Luffy. And he would find out why he was given a second chance. Sighing, Ace raised from the spot he has been in the last few hours and turned to face Oyaji's grave. Saying his goodbyes to his father, Ace traipsed over to his own grave. Taking a hold of his familiar orange cowboy hat, his knife and precious beads, he turned away, placing his hat around his neck. Slowly, he began to walk away from the two graves. The next time he'd be there, it'd be with his family. It had been around a week since Ace raised from his grave. And, to his misery, he was still stuck on the very unwelcoming island. It took a day of constant walking and searching to find out Ace was the only living resident on this island, which to Ace's frustration, meant there was nowhere he could find food, clothes, or the boat he needed to set sail. Instead, he was left with a herd of irritable monkeys that Ace had concluded shared the brain of a peanut. During that time though, Ace had come across a habitable camping spot near a lake, which thankfully contained no sea water, and decided to camp there for a few nights. That was the plan until he found a way off the island. He had bathed, hunted, eaten, and slept. The only things he was missing was something to cover himself in and something to sail away. Of course, to Ace's disappointment yet again, there was no escape your abandoned island kit set up and ready for him to take. After all, whoever had buried him there wasn't expecting anyone to leave. So that left him to find other means to get off the island. Sitting over a cliff, similar to the one he used to as a child, Ace sighed, reaching up for his hat. Slowly placing it on his knees in front of him, he took in every detail of the orange object. Gazing at it, he'd concluded that it had been a considerable amount of time since Marineford, noting the worn-out edges and faded color. Two ambivalent faces stared back at him, taunting Ace with all the knowledge it knew. Murmuring a mixture of words under his breath, he looked back up to the sea. Blinking a few times, Ace focused his misty black eyes. There was something in the corner of his eye. Either he was now hallucinating, or he could have sworn he saw a sail. Placing the hat back on his head, Ace jumped onto his feet, dashing to the tip of the cliff. A smile slowly crept across his face, as he saw something which he hadn't seen in days, even years. No way. He chuckled out, dashing towards the direction of the said object. It was Hope. What, the half-naked flame-thrower stood there, a mixture of feelings flowing through him. In front of him, a rotted wooden object the size of a cargo ship lied against the wall, making the already dark and sodden cave seem small. No way. Please tell me that isn't what I think it is. Being a pirate, Ace had expected to see a few shipwrecks here and there along his journey, and they were usually quite the sight. But now was not the time he had wanted to see one. Not when it was his only chance he had to escape. Dashing over to the once magnificent ship, Ace jumped inside, slowly examining what used to be the deck. His eyes stumbled the remnants of the wreckage, as he started to explore the inside of the ship. Just when he was content that there was no functioning equipment that could be used on the ship, the sound of something rustling echoed its way to Ace's ears. Huh? Is there someone else here? He would have found them by now, right? Not to mention, he'd have sensed them. He may have been underground for who knows how long, but the fire thrower was still capable of handling hockey. He'd experimented, fighting the monkeys, in his mind, they deserved it, to let off the anger he'd been building since waking up. He wasn't anywhere near as strong as he was before fighting Teach, but he was nowhere near weak. Though despite his own thoughts, Ace sprinted over to the place where the sounds had echoed from, only to be met with the now holy sight of a slightly damaged lateen boat. He had found his way off the island. Chapter 4. After dragging the rotten lateen boat to shore, Ace took a step back to assess the damage that the raft had. The boat wasn't exactly huge. Other than the fact it had massive broken sails towering over, most of the boat was missing a good part of its deck. And that wasn't the only problem. The solution to fixing these parts of the lateen boat was probably the biggest problem out of them all. The only resources Ace actually had on the island was trees, bits of debris from the shipwreck, and monkeys. And no matter how much the fire thrower wanted to kill the irritating creatures, he knew it would do no good. Ah, this is going to be a pain to fix. Ace groaned, shaking his head towards the sand. Well, I wasn't expecting this to be easy. Lifting his hand to sway the hair away from his eyes, Ace continued to move the lateen boat so that it was a comfortable distance away from the sea. After all, the last thing he needed was for his one little hope of escape float away happily into the sunset. Collapsing onto the sandy ground below him next to the raft, Ace laid back, allowing for the breeze to wash by him. His thoughts clouded by ways he could escape the island, he found his eyes becoming more heavy, slowly letting the darkness get a hold of him. Finally, the boat was finished. Well, more like the boat was usable. If you could call it a boat. The lateen was a peculiar-looking boat, having only one sail, compared to the two it had previously before Ace fixed it. The main and only mast was skillfully stuck together by a dozen coconut leaves, which seemed to work as it had a tenacious grip to the mast. Inside the boat was stacks of worn, battered boxes, stacked with fruit that Ace had gathered from the island, causing Ace to have another one-to-one match with the monkeys, and other vital resources such as water. Though, the object that stood out the most in the lateen was the grinning Ace himself, covered from head to toe in a white cloth which had previously been used to as the second sail, hiding all of his features. After all, he wanted to find Luffy and Marco first before he ran into any unwanted trouble. One thing you could recognize though, was the madman grin Ace had plastered on his face. Looking around the boat, he whistled impressively. Not too bad, if I say so myself. Ha, who knew I could build a ship? As he was talking to someone who disapproved of the ship, he grumbled, sitting down onto the far side of the boat. It's not like I'm a shipwright or anything, don't give me that look. Yeah. I hear ya. Okay, I admit it. The boat looks shit. He put his hands up in defense, as a scowl covering his face. Jumping over the side of the boat, Ace began to drag the lateen boat towards the sea. Previously, he couldn't understand how people could feel sentimental when they left an island they had been on for a certain amount of time. Sure, leaving Luffy behind in Fuchsia village was upsetting, and made him have sudden urges to run back and take Luffy with him, but Ace couldn't find anywhere more fitting as the sea being his home. He was all too fed up of this island. Actually, he couldn't be more happier being far, far away from it. So that was why, as soon as the tip of the boat hit the sea, a wild smirk sprang on Ace's face. Giving one last push, he toppled over the side of the boat, which had finally started to drift off with the tide. The white figure's smile faded, as he turned to look down to his hands, a thoughtful look shimmering through his eyes. An image of a 14-year-old Luffy with a huge grin on his face came to mind, his hands waving as he yelled his goodbyes to his brother. Looking up towards the sea before him, with a distant look his eyes, he whispered, his tone filled with regret. It's not long now. I'm going to see you again, Luffy. Not far from where Ace was sailing away, an immense figure the shape of a ship was sailing towards the island. A flag fluttered at the top of the main mast, dancing with the wind as an all-too-familiar logo was plastered to the black fabric. The logo was a simple skull and crossbones, the eyes narrowed with the mouth smirking in a mysterious way. Across the top of the mouth, however, has a mark that a couple of years ago would have scared pirates and marines alike. A mark which has faded throughout the tough years where they had been separated from their captain. A long white beard stretched across the skull's smirking face. "Captain, we're approaching the island." A tall, pale man stood at the front of the ship's deck, his eyes locked on the island ahead. His golden hair swayed in the wind along with the wind, his aura strong. The man sighed, closing his eyes before looking towards the crewmate which appeared to be talking to him. "Prepare to dock." A silent whisper came from his lips. "Oyaji, Ace. We're here."